Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Risking Enchantment. For this episode you've got myself, Rachel Sherlock, and we've got a new guest this week, which is very exciting. And the first guy we've had on the podcast.
Yeah.
Which is a very exciting because this is a non-discrimination zone.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on me. I'm representing quite a few things, including the male gender. This episode.
So with me this week is Matthias Conroy, who is a very good friend of mine, and we are part of a Bible study group. And after I conceived the idea of doing a podcast, we were having one of our Bible study groups where me and Matthias were just talking for ages and ages, and one of our other friends, Helen, said, "You guys should just do a podcast. I could listen to you talk all day." So
I forgot about that.
So this was a kind of given that I was going to invite Matthias on. And we've come on to talk about a topic that's very dear to both of our hearts,
Yes.
which is the need to make Catholicism weird again.
To use that so useful sort of format of make X, Y again.
Yes, yes. I mean, to be fair, I don't know whether Catholicism ever stopped being weird, but I think
True.
I think there's been a tendency, especially maybe within the last half century, to try and make it less weird.
Yes.
And we are not about that at all. We're all about making Catholicism weird again. So I think we're just going to start with like a little bit of background about why Catholicism is considered weird.
Yeah.
Which is, I suppose, the things that are normally leveled at us are, you know, we have lots of ritual, we have pomp, our masses and our services are like you kneel and you stand and you have all of these different kind of unusual aspects to them. And then outside of that, even in our normal day-to-day lives, we have our rosary beads and our scapulars and our Ash Wednesdays. I have this really distinct memory of being in university, and I was talking to a friend while waiting for a small study group with a lecturer of mine who was teaching us Old English. And he kind of arrived just as I was talking about the Feast of St. Blaise. So I was saying, because it was actually on the Feast of St. Blaise, and I said I got my blessing. And so I was describing how the priest just gets 2 candles and like holds them in an X shape against your throat and says a prayer, and it like protects you against throat illnesses.
And all disease, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's a great day. He was so confused, and then he just goes, "Are the candles lit?" Which I had to be like, no, they're just candles. In fact, I've only ever seen completely unlit ones, like they've never been lit.
Yeah, true.
And then because of that, I think Lent was starting the next week, so I was like, by the way, if you're not aware of this tradition, you might not also be aware of this other tradition. He had moved over from Wales, and I said, next week is Ash Wednesday, so we get ashes put in the shape of a cross on our forehead. So if you see someone with dirt on their forehead, that's okay. They know it's there. And I saw him the next Ash Wednesday, and he was like, "Thank you very much for warning me about that." But yeah, I think that's one of the ways that Catholicism looks very strange from the outside. There's a lot of things that we do that are outside the normal. And then the other aspect is the even crazier stuff that we, particularly in non-Western cultures, there's a lot more expressiveness in Catholicism, like the big parades and
and historically as well, I feel like a lot of the really like flamboyant Corpus Christi processions and stuff have kind of disappeared from the West, which I think is a loss.
It's really sad. Or even things like exorcism, or there's a lot of outward showing of your faith, which isn't in a lot of the other denominations. There's a tendency to turn inwards to the more personal relationship with Jesus, to the more spiritual aspect, and to say that we don't need these signs, we don't need these externalized signifiers of our faith, which I think is a real shame. I think it's, sure. And even I always feel really sad. I see great Christian talks that are filmed from various different Christian churches, but their churches are like, they look like university lectures, lecture halls, and I think that's really sad. Like I'm glad that we have our churches and our spaces that are so signified for the space of worship. But I think for the podcast, what we're mainly going to do is make an argument for not only why Catholicism can and should be weird, but also the examples of great Catholic art and culture that is specifically weird, and what that's contributed to the kind of Catholic imagination. But before all of that, just to talk about why we need all of these externalities, I think that's a big question, certainly from other Christian denominations, and also from atheists. Like, why do you need all of these? Why do you need a shrine in your house? Why do you need like these sort of physical objects and, like I said, externalized signifiers of your faith, when your faith is something that, you know, is intangible?
Yes, yeah.
But in some ways, to me, like, it really doesn't make sense to make faith so intangible, because
we're embodied souls. Like, we're not just thoughts
Yeah.
flying around the place.
Yeah, there's definitely, I had a priest at university who really drove home to me the whole both and of Catholicism.
Yes. Oh.
Which is, I'm sure, like, as far as I know, it's been a huge theme throughout Catholic writing for pretty much the length of the church.
I would say in some form at least.
But that Catholicism is the reconciling of two things, so it's not an either or, it's a both and.
Yes.
That is drawn from the life of Jesus himself and from the Bible. So the idea that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine, that Mary is both virgin and mother, that all of these aspects are in kind of direct conflict with each other.
In a sense, yeah.
And that Catholicism, at least, boldly proclaims both things to be true at once.
Yeah.
And I've got, it's not quite a quote, because I'll be honest, I actually just took it from the Bishop Barron pivotal players on G.K. Chesterton. So some of it's his quotes and some of it's more Bishop Barron's commentary, but he had this beautiful section of that particular episode where he was talking about G.K. Chesterton and how he began to understand the faith. He was saying how he looked at the critics of Catholicism and looked at what they were criticising the church for, and it would always be criticised for two kind of diametrically opposed things at once. So it's both overly pessimistic in the way that it has contempt for the world, kind of contempt for the self in terms of the sinful self, but it's also, as Bishop Barron said, wildly and irresponsibly optimistic.
Yes.
That we have this idea of eternal fulfillment, and that this salvation that's so optimistic and that anyone can achieve, and that is open to anyone. Or the timid monkishness, and how the Sermon on the Mount and Turn the Other Cheek, and this very meek and humble religion that's also accused at the same time of being bloodthirsty and in favour of war and the Crusades and things like that. And I think the one that kind of drives home to people the most is G.K. Chesterton had a quote which was the naked and hungry habits, which is the austere and the asceticism of religious life, in tandem with the fact that it's too worldly and too pompous and has too many nice things. And so G.K. Chesterton's understanding of it was to say that the quote is, perhaps in short, this extraordinary thing is in fact the ordinary thing, or at least the normal thing, the centre. And the idea that actually it's not about a middle road, it's not about something that isn't too one way or too the other, that fits nicely into boxes, that doesn't offend or isn't challenging, but actually instead it's something that confidently puts two opposing ideas together and lets those excesses balance each other out in a way.
It's one of those things, I think, where I always love the stories of people who they use their criticism, their criticizers to coin their name. So, like the Impressionists, for instance, who used that as a criticism and then became the famous name for them. Same with Jesuits, actually.
Or the Big Bang Theory.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, another great part of Catholic culture. But it's almost like our critics have actually pointed out a really important thing about Catholic culture and about theology and about the everyday life of the church, is this both and thing. And we didn't necessarily, need them to point it out, but it's actually, they've hit on something really important with these criticisms.
Yeah, that in a way it's entirely to be expected that Catholicism is weird, because it's not that Christianity or Catholicism is illogical, but in a way that the my ways are not your ways. So there is that intervention of divine knowledge that confounds our own expectations. And again, G.K. Chesterton was saying that it's almost like it's not a peg that would fit in any hole, but rather a key specifically designed to fit inside a specific lock.
Yeah, no, it's also him who said the thing that, like, pink, we like our red and we like our white, but we don't like much in the middle, which is not, we do like pink on the Atari Sunday. Yes. We don't settle for this sort of mishmash middle ground fallacy. We want absolutely and absolutely not in a sense.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the really exciting things as well, that you can have a canon of saints that has someone like Francis of Assisi or even Catherine of Siena, who live these really ascetic lives, but you also have the other saints who are monarchs. And it's not that some people get to be worldly and some people get to be ascetic, but in some ways that the two should live in the one person. And in our last episode, we were actually talking about chivalry and how the interesting thing and the way that it fails, but also the reason why it's an ideal in the first place is that it holds two exclusive things in the same. So you have to be mild and meek and, very courtly and polite and gentle, while also being this powerful and strong knight and courageous knight. And how that episode we were saying that, Lewis said that the reason that existed is because humanity needs the ability to counterbalance its own weakest tendencies. So it's telling that St. Francis of Assisi was rich and powerful and worldly. And to counterbalance that, he became an ascetic.
Yes.
I think that it's all about finding our weakest spots and counterbalancing them with an effusion of grace that says, actually, I'm going to go in this different direction because through grace, anything is possible.
Yes.
So that's kind of our background to why Catholicism is probably weird.
Yes. Yeah.
And why we're not afraid to have it be weird. I think there is a fear of scaring people or putting people off. But the problem with that is that Jesus is a wildly challenging figure who was crucified because of his views.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not as if Jesus came to make people feel comfortable.
Yeah, no, indeed, yeah. And I find it's quite interesting. I heard a point someone made recently where they were talking about how we as Catholics have actually often abandoned things about Catholic culture, especially in the last, 60, 70 years, whatever, and how, you will not see Gregorian chant in a lot of churches these days, but if you go to an action film, that bit where they have the slowdown and they have the, Bruce Willis jumping through the window, they're playing Gregorian chant, they're playing like orchestral style music or like music with an organ or something, and they realise how this signifies something big is happening in the moment, something really important is going down, but we've actually lost that in showing that we have something really important going down. I
think that's really interesting because in some ways, as much as we get criticised for it, it's actually something that the world really longs for, that there is a sense that everyone is yearning for that.
Yes.
Even if they want it on their own terms. So I think the best example of that was this time last year, I think, when they had the Met Gala, which the theme was heavenly bodies and the Catholic imagination.
It's a bad start when the phrase heavenly bodies is the first two words in the title. I
read some really interesting articles. They were just highlighting both the good and the negative aspects of it. So obviously there were some negative aspects. It was, in a lot of cases, sexualizing what might be considered sacred. Yeah. But at the same time, it was this demonstration that actually the world is captivated by big miters and the brocaded materials, and that it evokes something in people that makes them long for it. And similarly, our small group at the moment, we're watching The Young Pope, which we're watching critically.
Yes,
I'm sure we'll do a podcast on it. It's not that we're going in hoping it's going to be a lovely Catholic romp. But at the same time, there is something really fascinating about it. Watching I haven't looked into it that deeply, but I'm assuming at least a secular, if not atheist, conception of this story, which the whole basis of it is that a young pope comes and reinstitutes a lot of the things that Catholicism has lost.
Yes.
Including the physical objects that we've put aside because they're too weird.
Yes, yeah.
And there is a sense that, again, there is a longing to see this and a longing for... I don't know whether people would say that they're longing for it to return, but that it evokes something in them that aspires to higher things.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think that we were just talking about this before we started the podcast, we were talking about famous, I guess you'd know with the Agatha Christie story, where a bunch of some Catholic, mainly non-Catholic, cultural figures of the time, I guess, commentators, artists, writers, gathered together to essentially get an indulge from Pope St. Paul VI to have the traditional Latin Mass still celebrated in England. And there's actually a great quote from the person who started the whole endeavour. His name is Alfred Marnaw. Probably butchering that pronunciation. But it's kind of, it's going further into that point about these people are fascinated by these things even if they don't necessarily believe what's behind them. So the quote is, "We are not at this moment considering the religious or spiritual experience of millions of individuals. The right in question, in its magnificent Latin text, has also inspired a host of priceless achievements in the arts. Not only mystical works, but works by poets, philosophers, musicians, architects, painters and sculptors, in all countries and epochs. Thus, it belongs to universal culture, as well as to churchmen and formal Christians." So yeah, I think that's kind of...
I think that's perfect.
Yeah.
Like, and that's a real example of how the Mass itself goes outside the Catholic Church and becomes truly Catholic, because it serves as a springboard for imagination to things that are beautiful. And as we would discuss on this podcast, that all things that are beautiful, truly beautiful, are leading towards Christ.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think it was such a perceptive and reflective moment for all of these cultural figures to say, I'm not Catholic, but I owe something to this tradition. And that not only that it's worth preserving, but they were essentially kind of demanding it, because they said, you can't take this away from us. This isn't yours to take away. This is all of the world's. And that's maybe one of the most Catholic things you can think of. That something that's specific to Catholicism actually applies to the universe itself, whether the people feel like they engage with the faith or not. And I think, I'm sure, Matthias, you've got a lot of things on the liturgy itself. I think that's your kind of special interest area.
Yes, no, for reference, I act as one of the Masters of Ceremonies for the Dublin Latin Mass chaplaincy, so
which is very cool.
It is. It's great. I love doing it, but so that is something I'm somewhat passionate about. You could say. Yeah.
But that also, I think we've discussed a lot about whether it's specifically traditional Latin Mass or whether it's Novus Ordo or any of those kind of expressions of the Mass. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't hope and expect to see a certain level of sacramentality and ritual to each and every Mass. And that there is easy things that we can bring back that have been sadly lost.
Yeah, and I think that it's almost an opportunity for us now, that the fact that a lot of these traditionally, quote unquote, traditionally Catholic practices, which have now been sort of dropped in the favour of, in certain cases, nothing. In certain cases, they've just kind of been done away with for not necessarily even any good reason. But because for many years this would have just been like a natural thing, and people would have grown up with it, and they never really would have questioned these different traditions and these different sort of obscure gestures, as people often call them, or whatever. And there's actually quite a good opportunity to be like, oh well, here's why the priest holds his thumb and forefinger together after the consecration, or like, here's why we use a communion plate when it's like, and you can actually do this sort of catechesis about the nature of the Catholic faith, the nature of the Eucharist, the nature of the liturgy, and by saying why we did these things in the first place.
And you can almost take it step by step.
Yeah.
Because you can reintroduce them one at a time and say, well, we're going to explain this. And this is why we're doing it.
Yes.
And hopefully encourage people to actually try and understand. Because like that's the saddest thing about the Vatican II, was that the hope was for people to really learn and understand what the Mass was about.
Yes.
And that is a really noble aim. And it's really sad that in some ways it's just gotten so much worse in terms of, although it's kind of hard to tell, because I guess lots of people could have been going to Latin Mass and not really understood any of it.
Of course,
But making these changes haven't actually improved people's knowledge.
I think kind of what they saw was a very real problem, which was a lot of people, and this was even before Vatican II, like the last 100 years before the sort of the liturgical movement, so to speak. They noticed that faithful just weren't as engaged as they should be, and they weren't praying the Mass. And it was a completely valid criticism, a completely valid observation, and there was sort of clericalism rampant and so on and so forth. And I think what they tried to do as a solution to that, and what they very wisely posited, was we should have more catechesis, people should understand what the Mass is about, and we should make some changes to the Mass, so to reflect that, to make some, and that's kind of what St. John the 23rd wanted to do. But I think what almost happened was they kind of turned entirely on its head, and we really changed the liturgy, or we certainly made some changes to the liturgy, and kind of didn't end up doing the catechesis in the end, which was almost the more important part. I feel like you actually could have gotten a huge amount of the way there just by people being more well informed and actually praying the Mass better.
I totally agree, because I do try to stay away from a sort of false nostalgia for a Catholic past that probably didn't exist at any particular it maybe existed for some people at some times, but not for the vast majority of people. But that doesn't mean that those traditions aren't worth bringing back or resurrecting. Thankfully, we are a faith of resurrection.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, but I find it quite interesting that it's like people often talk about how in the past, people, they sort of, they prayed the rosary during Mass. They didn't really understand what was going on. That definitely was a thing in certain places. But like even a friend of mine, both of his, he's not a practicing Catholic anymore, but both of his grandfathers, one stopped going to Mass after the Latin Mass was taken away, and one became SPX. He was one of the first people to be involved in the Society of St. Pius X, which is a radical Catholic traditionalist sort of semi-schismatic group.
So they went completely divergent.
In a sense, yeah, but both of them clearly had some kind of relationship with the traditional Latin Mass that when it left. And I'm definitely not saying, we must go back to the traditional Latin Mass. Every priest should, start celebrating the Latin Mass every single day. far from it, and it'd be a terrible idea. But I think that even back then, people saw the value in these things, and I think to restore that would be wonderful.
Yeah, and I think I've touched on it on one of the podcasts before, but I'm actually just going to bring up a quote from C.S. Lewis, which is about pomp and ceremony, and why having those trappings was actually important, and was actually important to the way that we understand society. So I think that I brought it up when I was doing the episode with Maria on liturgical living, which a lot of this is actually tied in with, because again, liturgical living is like an outward sign of an inward faith.
Yes.
The full quote, and this is from interestingly, it's from his preface to an edition of Paradise Lost. But he says, "The very fact that pompous is now used only in a bad sense measures the degree to which we have lost the old idea of solemnity. To recover it, you must think of a court ball, or a coronation, or a victory march, as these things appear to people who enjoy them. In an age when everyone puts on his oldest clothes to be happy in, you must reawake the simpler state of mind in which people put on gold and scarlet to be happy in. Above all, you must be rid of the hideous idea, fruit of a widespread inferiority complex, that pomp on the proper occasions has any connection with vanity or self-conceit. A celebrant approaching the altar, a princess led out by a king to dance a minuet, a general officer on a ceremonial parade, a major domo preceding the boar's head at a Christmas feast hall. These wear unusual clothes and move with calculated dignity. This does not mean that they are vain, but that they are obedient. They are obeying the hoc age which presides over every solemnity. The modern habit of doing ceremonial things unceremoniously is no proof of humility. Rather, it proves the offender's inability to forget himself in the rite, his readiness to spoil for everyone else the proper pleasure of ritual."
Oh, that's so good. I love that quote so much.
No, I think of all places to find it in the preface to Paradise Lost. I feel like I'm amazed that anyone kind of dug it up.
But
it's such a beautiful piece, because in some ways it should assuage that fear that by putting on your best clothes on Sunday that you're showing off, or that by engaging in something that's so over the top in some ways, or so overtly ostentatious, that's about you.
Yes, yeah.
When really it's about God.
Yeah, and I love what. So there's a sort of traddy group they're based in France, I think, originally, but there's a group of them in Limerick, and Institute of Christ the King. And I think they exemplify this so well, because they have a really beautiful church. They're restoring it. They put it in an altar rail recently, which is nice. But they have beautiful vestments and well-trained servers. You can actually go to their Twitter account. You can see nice photos from the church. But they're spending like all of their money on the church, and their house is falling down about their ears. Yeah. So eventually they're going to have to make sure the house doesn't literally collapse and they're out of a home. But I think that's such a great way to have your priorities. That it's like, we will give all the pomp and all the ceremony to God, and it's entirely focused on God, and we don't care if there's a drip in the corner of the kitchen or whatever. And I think it's like that should be the case. The priest is walking into the church and his clothes are falling off him, and then he puts on this beautiful velvet vestments. I think it's kind of that again, that dichotomy that sort of we were talking about earlier. I think is so important.
I've had quite a few long discussions with some friends who are not religious, and I can actually understand. I'm not trying to dismiss them out of hand, but their issue with seeing a really lavishly decorated church and saying, is this not supposed to be a faith where you tend to the poor? And as Chesterton would point out, that like the glorious thing about Catholicism is that it's able to do both at the same time.
Yes,
but that my other point was that the churches are also for the poor.
Yes, yeah.
And that there's very few places in some ways that you can go where you are treated equally in this beautiful space. Like, it is just as much for the person who's panhandling outside as it is for the businessman who walks in. And there's not like a box for the for the wealthier people, but that it's everyone's right, no matter where they are in life, to be able to go to a beautiful church and pray. And there was this really interesting study that was done about the impact that churches have, because in some ways the study was about a couple of different types of buildings. So you have churches, libraries, I'm sure some like public buildings and museums, but any of these spaces that are very obviously beautiful, you would hope. There are some bad examples of all of them.
Quite.
But in terms of the examples of the beloved, beautiful architecture, that it has a neurological effect on people.
Yes.
That they compared it to almost like instant meditation.
Mm.
So that there is a neurological change that goes on in your mind when you enter these spaces that allows you to enter a contemplative and a transcendent state of mind. That's the right of every person, that to be able to have a space where they can do that and encounter God and have a better chance of allowing themselves to encounter God, because our minds are such busy, cluttered places that, and not all of us are particularly proficient at practicing meditation or mindfulness or any of these practices, but that shouldn't stop anyone from being able to go into a church and feel that space. And I was listening to an interview recently between two people who are completely not religiously affiliated at all, and one of them is a comedian and a filmmaker, but he said, what I do is I go into churches, and they
I actually saw that as well.
they kind of dismissed it as saying, well, I'm sure because it's quiet. But even he said, and you can't really take out your phone. Well, why can't you take out your phone in a church? Because you know it's not the proper thing to do. You know it's not the solemn thing to do. Like, this is a space that's aside from all of that. And I think that there's such a beauty in having that available to people. And that, I don't know, I've seen a couple of churches that charge for entry, but the vast majority of them, like even somewhere like St. Peter's in Rome, does not charge for entry. And so, and so because it's not about who you are, it's for everyone. And I was trying to explain this to my friend, that the priest doesn't own that church. That often the people who are, let's say, presiding over a particular church, it's not theirs.
No, not at all.
It belongs to the church, but in the way that the church serves the people, it belongs to the people. And so I think we're really blessed to have this rich heritage of having these spaces that are so set aside from your office, your car, even your home, that allow you to encounter God. And obviously we believe that God is actually physically present in the Eucharist, which helps. So when you go to that, you are stepping into a space. But that it kind of confounds the idea that churches should just be like a sports hall that has a tabernacle, or like those other Christian denominations who, like I said, were doing amazing preaching, but they're just a university lecture hall. And so that there's something intrinsic in the way that churches are built or were built that helps you encounter God. I'll link the actual study in the description, but it was Dr. Julio Bermudez and his team research focused on buildings and sites designed to elicit contemplation. They theorized that the presence of contemplative architecture in one's environment may, over time, produce the same health benefits as traditionally internally induced meditation, except with much less effort by the individual. The non-profit research center interweaves private and public spaces with a strikingly formal, inward-looking plan that echoes the format of a medieval cloister. Composed of strong-willed yet sensuous materials, it possesses a hushed dignity that encourages contemplation. And that, so far, the research has proven that against what some of the apostles of practicality preach, architectonic design is not a mere accessory. So
that is great, And I'm going to, if I may, go ahead and bring something from old Tom, say Thomas Aquinas, on this subject. I think this is actually such a good...
For a second I thought you were going to say Tom Bombadil. I was really
He is a merry fellow. Right, where we take it is. Okay, so this is St. Thomas. The human mind, in order to be united to God, needs to be guided by the sensible world, since, quote, invisible things, ellipsis, are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, as the apostle says. That's Romans chapter 1, verse 20. Wherefore, in the divine worship, it is necessary to make use of corporeal things, that man's mind may be aroused thereby, as by signs, to the spiritual acts by means of which he is united to God. Therefore, the internal acts of religion take precedence of the others, and belong to religion essentially, while its external acts are secondary and subordinate to the internal acts. And that's something you always really need to prioritize when you're talking about these liturgical things, where it's like, these things are beautiful, but ultimately, if you have great vestments, great servers, everyone is dressed in their Sunday best, and no one there is actually devoted to Jesus Christ, then it's a total waste.
There's
nothing really there. Like, there's a tiny bit maybe of offering art to God, which is good in and of itself, but when push comes to shove, if it's not bringing you to Christ, then this is Don Benedict of the Benedictine Silver Stream. There's a short documentary about them, actually, which is worth a look. I might put it in the show notes. It's only 50 minutes long. But he was saying that, like, if the liturgy does not bring you to Christ, it's just not serving its purpose.
Absolutely.
And that goes for liturgy in the broad sense of, like, daily prayer, buildings, art, so on and so forth.
Yeah, because it should be an outward sign of an existing inward faith. That the externals only come from the internal. And I think the best example of what Thomas Aquinas was saying is when you see, there's an incredible video going around Twitter at the moment where it's showing, I think it's in Nigeria, but it's soldiers who are kneeling in the middle of just a dirt road for benediction, and they're in the process of fighting Boko Haram, and so they're having this encounter with God. And it's funny because it does include both, because it's literally a dirt road, there's no altar, but they have these beautiful thuribles and things like that, so that there is an element of right praise, but that it's doing what you can where you can. Yes, and so it's better to have the actual desire to be close to God rather than these externalities. Yeah. It's particularly when your circumstances. There's another one of is it Father Emile Capon, where he's holding mass for the Vietnam troops on the hood of his...
I think I've heard about this.
On the hood of his van. And that's so beautiful. And obviously that's incredible. And obviously I don't think anyone should say, well, if you can't get to a lovely decorated church, you shouldn't have mass. That's ridiculous. But that it is right and fitting that we should express ourselves in these ways, and that we shouldn't feel self-conscious about how weird Catholicism is. I find it very strange when people, first of all, in the most uncharitable way possible, I always find the phrase "I'm spiritual" quite kind of just a bit boring, which I have plenty of incredible friends who that's how they would express themselves, and I think that they probably have a really deep understanding and wrestling of what they're trying to get through. So that's not dismissive. But I get excited about being able to express my faith in a particular way, that I don't have to shrink from the concrete element of it, that it means that I fast at these times, it means that I wear these clothes at these times, it means that I set aside this time for this, and that allows me to feel like my faith is integrated with all parts of my life. Yes. I think it's really beautiful.
So what's the quote from... I can't think of the letters. I think it might be Romans again, the God being all in all idea. That's like in the fullness of time. So it's like we can do a little bit here to make God all in our own lives.
And it's really telling then in the book of the Apocalypse that in the heavenly Jerusalem there is no temple.
Yes, yeah, I love that. I was talking about that last night. It's such a beautiful idea. That the whole city is the temple. Yeah. And that, again, the body is the temple as well. That, like, all parts of you are the temple. And so the things that you do and the things that you say and the way that you express yourself is an expression of your faith. And in all of its contradictory and weird natures. Yes, indeed, yeah.
And that faith is way more hard and difficult and costly. I think that's actually a phrase that Flannery O'Connor uses, that the faith is costly, that it's not a comforter, it's not a duvet to wrap yourself in, and that kind of it shouldn't go down so smooth. And that the tendency to try and make religion fit the world is in some ways it's kind of an illogical thing, because the world should fit religion in a way. And that the expression of faith where it doesn't challenge or confound or even upset people is in some ways like a representative of timidity around it. I know Flannery O'Connor has this great quote, it's from her letters, so it's in the book The Habit of Being, which I would really recommend. I think I've said it before, but I love her fiction, but I would almost recommend her letters first. I was listening to one of the Word on Fire recently had their digital summit, which was incredible, and actually my friend Stephen Bullivant was on it, so I was very, very happy to be able to listen to that. But I'm trying to think who it was, but someone was saying, I think it was Dr. Todd Warner, was saying which book of G.K. Chesterton's would he recommend to Catholics first. And his suggestion, which I thought was actually a really good suggestion, was just read some of his quotes first, because his actual books can be quite intimidating, or there's a lot in them, so they can be difficult to get through. But actually read his quotes first. And I feel like in some ways it's the same with Flannery O'Connor. Okay, sure. Because I think you get a sense of her tone and her perspective, particularly from her letters, or, quotes from her letters, gives you the key to understanding her fiction. Because I think if you just go in cold, it can be a bit strange and weird. And we're going to come back to her fiction later. Sure. But she says in one of her letters, a higher paradox confounds emotion as well as reason. And there are long periods in the lives of all of us, and of the saints, when the truth as revealed by faith is hideous, emotionally disturbing, downright repulsive. Witness the dark night of the soul in individual saints. Right now, the whole world seems to be going through a dark night of the soul. There is a question whether faith can or is supposed to be emotionally satisfying. I must say that the thought of everyone lolling about in an emotionally satisfying faith is repugnant to me. I believe that we are ultimately directed Godward, and that this journey is often impeded by emotion. So that's the other element of weirdness, is that it confronts you. Yes. And that it should make you stop and think. And strangeness, I was thinking of this, what makes something strange is the combination, as far as I can tell, it's almost always the combination of something familiar with something unexpected.
I like that. Yeah, no, that makes sense, yeah.
And so, or that's specifically in uncanniness, and I did a lot of study of the uncanny when I was at university.
Sure, yeah.
And so it's that sense of being at home and not being at home. It's the familiar when something has changed. And like we said, that's very representative in Christ. He is something familiar, a man who is also God.
Yes. Yeah.
All of those great biblical paradoxes have that sense of it's one expectation confounded by another expectation. And so the strangeness, it's not even just a smug, oh, we're not like the rest of the world because we do our own thing. That's very simplistic, and that's cliquish and elitist in the sense that it's almost like saying we know better than the world because we're doing this thing.
Yeah.
If that's the aim of being strange, and if that's the aim of your rituals, that is not that does not have a good purpose. Yeah. But in terms of, particularly through art and culture, it should be to shock people, but to shock them into a kind of contemplation.
Yes, yeah. No, I completely agree. I think that, it's like you need to take people out of like the daily haze in a sense, and like actually like show them something.
Because your whole life is so caught up in your thoughts and your chores and your to-do list, and it's so easy to go through life in a sort of, like you said, like a haze where you're not actually questioning the world around you. Yeah. And I think some people would be surprised to hear that because they assume that faith is about taking everything as given.
Yeah.
And, and existing in that haze where you just don't question. Yeah. But it isn't. It is about, it's about encountering the paradox that is the all-powerful God who decides to become a baby in a manger. Like, there's no, that should be an uncomfortable juxtaposition. Yes. And I was saying to Matthias, Phoebe and I have been planning, long before we had a podcast, we said that we wanted to do something where we talked about the paradox of having beautiful churches with horrendous looking crucifixes in the middle of them. Yes, and so we'll be doing a full episode on that in Lent, but just to touch on that, the idea, that beautiful paradox that we hold up as a victory standard, our crucified Lord. Yes. That should be unsettling. And yes. I often find when I see people online who are unsettled by it, I saw someone who was saying how unfair it is to have crucifixes in schools because of how disturbing it was. There's that gut instinct to be like, oh, don't tell us not to have crucifixes. Yeah. But in some ways, they've almost got it. Yeah, no, I mean, that was literally just thinking. I was actually like, in a way, I'm glad it's become, because it's a crazy thing to be uttering from my mouth, but literally an image of someone being tortured to death has almost become like common garden for us. It's like something we just see, and it's like, oh yeah, there's a crucifix, and it's like, this is literally, never mind that he's God, never mind that why he's doing it for us. This is literally someone like dying, and often looks quite like pained. Yeah, it's almost, I hate to use the word good because good is a really odd word to use in this context, but well, it's the good of Good Friday. Sure, yeah, good point. Yeah, good point. But no, indeed, the fact that it is shocking people is almost like what it's meant to do in a sense. I preach one thing, Christ crucified. And even to a more upsetting, I guess, example for me was someone was telling me recently that they were talking to a priest who was giving communion catechesis, and he was talking to the parents for one session, and then he was going to talk to the kids. Sure. And when he explained to the parents what the Eucharist was, he explained it, and she said, "Do not dare tell my children that. That's disgusting." Yeah. Now, obviously, if you want to remain in the Catholic faith, that's something you're going to have to take on board. But the fact that we do consume the body, blood, soul, and divinity, and we believe in that, not in a symbolic way, but in an actual way, that it is disgusting, at first glance at least, that it should make you feel uncomfortable and unsettled. It's so much more than a wafer or a piece of bread or a symbol. Or as Flannery O'Connor once so eloquently put it, if it's a symbol, to hell with it. That's just it. That's great. Yeah. But yeah, so actually, maybe speaking of Flannery O'Connor, will we go through some of the kind of cultural examples of weirdness in Catholicism that we've been enjoying? So, as I said in the very first episode, Flannery O'Connor is one of my all-time favorite authors and writers and people generally. I think she's amazing. But she is a Catholic writer through and through, and actually she kind of objected to, so Graham Greene was writing at the same time, and he was essentially saying that his writing is kind of in spite of his Catholicism, or that it's to one side of his faith, which I think in some ways is a bit of self-denial, because as Flannery O'Connor says, that actually as a Catholic everything you do is kind of through the lens of being a Catholic. She really disdained that, and she was really adamant that she writes the way she does because she is a Catholic, which I think people find really surprising, because her stories are weird and disturbing, and they're often about very unsettling people. You've got murderers, you've got con artists, racists. One of her very famous stories involves someone dressing up as a gorilla. They are genuinely strange. Like, if you think it's just on the edge of being strange, it's totally not. It's
taking the plunge.
it is very much taking the plunge, and it's about a lot of strange people. Now, I've some people that I follow online who are from the American South, and they're like, well, that's just the American South. So some of it is just drawn from reality, but she had that ability to write from this perspective of a particular place in which, as they're called in a lot of the critiques, freaks are the daily occurrence. And so she gets asked a lot why she writes about them. A lot of her short stories, so she has, I think, 2 novels, and then the rest are short stories. And most of them end pretty tragically. Sure. The formula that she says is that each story is about a moment where someone is offered grace. And for the most part, they reject it. So most of them end pretty unhappily. Yet they're written with such clarity and with Flannery O'Connor's incredible wit that I don't find them that heavy to read, but I can see how others would. But she was asked about it, and she had this quote, which is incredible. "Whenever I'm asked why Southern writers particularly have a penchant for writing about freaks, I say it is because we are still able to recognise one. To be able to recognise a freak, you have to have some conception of the whole man. And in the South, the general conception of man is still, in the main, theological. That is a large statement, and it is dangerous to make it, for almost anything you say about Southern belief can be denied in the next breath with equal propriety. But approaching the subject from the standpoint of the writer, I think it is safe to say that while the South is hardly Christ-centred, it is most certainly Christ-haunted. The Southerner who isn't convinced of it is very much afraid that he may have been formed in the image and likeness of God. Ghosts can be very fierce and instructive. They cast strange shadows, particularly in our literature. In any case, it is when the freak can be sensed as a figure for our essential displacement that he attains some depth in literature." So she's almost showing the brokenness of society as it really is. Yes, like, we all live these very boring, straightforward lives, but in a sense there is that inward brokenness and this inward displacement that she externalizes in her literature, which I really, really love. And then just another quote by her, which is why she feels like she has to do this. And she says, "When you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs you do, you can relax a little, and the more normal ways of talking to it. When you have to assume that it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing you shout, and for the blind you draw large and startling figures."
It's so true, and it's like it's kind of like, I mean, we touched on it earlier, but I feel like it is that thing of we now need to, like, there's almost a generation has been born outside of Catholic culture in certain ways, and so I mean, she's writing this. I don't know when she
was writing. I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure it was the 1950s.
Sure, yeah.
But that quote was specifically about her being a Catholic writer in the Southern Protestant South.
Yes. Yeah.
So in a way, it's similar to now, which is that Catholic writers are writing to a completely secular audience, and she was a Catholic writing to a completely Protestant audience, and not only that, but a Protestant audience that did not feel the need to be reconciled to Catholicism now. So whereas now we might see a bit more ecumenism between the two, that divide was still largely there at the time.
Sure, yeah. But no, and it is that thing that Catholicism is very shocking in many ways, and to get that across, you do need to, be true to it and shock people.
I have 2 more quotes from her, and then I'll give it a rest. But she said, "And more than ever now it seems that the kingdom of heaven has to be taken by violence, or not at all. You have to push as hard as the age that pushes against you." And I think in some ways it's not about a return to clericalism. It's not about a return to an imagined past when the church was glorified. In a culture that's so secularized, there's a sense that if you became the Catholic culture that you want to be, at least there's something to point to. In some ways that, like, I would almost say, and I've seen it even within my own life and within my own friends, that the first step of evangelization is often just that you live a happy life and that your life doesn't look like other people's lives.
Yes, yeah.
And so that could almost be a bridging point where people say, well, I don't agree with you on all of these hot button issues, but you seem to have something that I want and I don't have.
Yes.
And so if we're afraid to actually show what we have, then it's harder to bridge that gap because you're just a nice person who seems to be happy.
Yes, no, and actually I think that in the current age, and so this is actually, I'm going to slip in a short quote from Marshall McLuhan. He was a communication theorist. He was the guy who came up with the medium is the message phrase. Mm-hmm. But he was talking about how it was almost the worst era for priests and nuns to start walking around in plain clothes was the year that they did it, so around 60s, 70s. Because that was basically the time when like media was really on a stark upwards trajectory and the optics of things really mattered. And so as you were saying, almost just like a priest walking down the street in a cassock take you out of your reverie for a second, and it's like, even if you don't know the person, it's like, oh, like in fact I was actually just talking to a woman, and she was it was at a talk that a Dominican was giving, and she was talking about how she was going through a rough time in her life with family life and so on and so forth, but she just saw a brother or a priest walking down the street in a Dominican habit, and it was a huge eureka moment for her, and she was like, okay, well, and she started going to Dominic Street where the Dominicans are now, and actually just the power of someone literally saying absolutely nothing but just walking by you in a distinctly different sort of costume. And the quote is, what the young are obviously telling us is this: we want beards, we want massive costumes and vestments for everybody. We do not want any of this simple, plain, individual stuff. I think it's so true. Yeah,
that is bang on. I really like that. And I've had that experience so many times. I'll be talking with a friend who's in a Dominican habit, and if everyone in the cafe around us says, what is going on?
Yes, yeah.
But we're just having coffee. That's an opportunity for evangelization and going out into the culture, that you preserve your own Catholicism and then you go out into the world and you show them the juxtaposition of those two things.
Yeah.
And I think it's summed up in that phrase, we are meant to be in the world but not of the world.
Yes.
That you're surrounded by the world, but that you have your own sense of who you are as a Catholic.
Yes.
And that it shouldn't, like I said, that it shouldn't go down so smooth. It shouldn't be the saccharine thing. That my last Flannery quote is that, this one is very funny. As for fiction, the motto of the Catholic press should be, we guarantee to corrupt nothing but your taste. Which she's saying very disparagingly, that the Catholic fiction at the time was so sweet that you couldn't possibly ever think of something negative in relation to it, except that it's poor art.
Yes.
And I absolutely love that. I think she's incredible.
Yeah, I think it's the issue with a lot of like modern Christian music. I think especially Christian music is it's aside from the fact it's always the same four chords, there's always storm metaphors. It's not like challenging you in any way, and it's just literally like throwing out some vaguely sacred sounding words. And also, not to say all Christian music is bad by any stretch, but I find often I much prefer music that is Christian rather than Christian music. I
would agree, and I think that's really interesting. I know, I'm trying to think whether it was the same interview we were referencing earlier, but I clearly listened to too many interviews because I cannot remember where this is from. But someone was saying that they actually get annoyed when they turn on the radio and they're flicking through the different stations, and they hear some like rock music and you're like, yes, this is what I want to listen to, and then it gets to the chorus and it's all about Jesus, and they like slam on the brakes and change the station because that's not what they were hoping for. There is, I mean, like, that's definitely an element of confounding expectations, and I'm sure there's some good to that, but in some ways I feel like people don't always want your pill squished into some ice cream for you to take it down with. That almost, if it was a whole thing in and of itself, that it would be more approachable because people know what they're getting into. But like I said, I'm not completely disparaging Christian music.
Not at all, no.
And I would also say, I think it serves a purpose for Christians
very
as well.
Much so, yeah.
But yeah, I just thought it was really interesting that someone was talking about how they didn't like being sneakily brought into a praise and worship song.
That's one thing that actually I'm gonna preface this by being it's extremely simplified what I'm about to say, and it's not even close to being the full truth. But I think almost the more, I want to say, bare bones new mass liturgies, when there's a lot of the music has been taken out, or it's the bare bones of what the mass is. It's still enormously beneficial for Catholics, practicing Catholics, because they get to worship God. The priest offers the holy sacrifice of the mass, and you get to receive Holy Communion if you're in a state of grace, and so on and so forth. So there's still an enormous degree of prayerful value to the mass, regardless of how it's celebrated, as long as it's valid. But for a liturgy to be truly beautiful and to really exemplify all the things that are sort of, if you want to say, objectively beautiful about a right and proper liturgical celebration, it can almost be a form of evangelization in and of itself, and it can be a form of showing something that even people who aren't explicitly religious can appreciate.
I think, because isn't that what converted Thomas Merton?
I was literally reading that, or at least skimming that story a little while ago. It's really worth a read. Yeah, Thomas Merton's conversion story about he basically left halfway through the mass because it was like too much almost.
Sensory overload.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it was just something, he just knew something really, really important was happening. And the bells were ringing and stuff, and he was just like, I need to get out of here. And he did, but his life was never the same afterwards. It's actually, I would highly recommend reading that story. It's quite impressive. Yeah,
I really love it, and I think there is a real desire for that. Like, I think it's telling that the religious orders that are on the rise are the habited ones, the ones that are taken apart from the world in a way. Like, some of them are cloistered, some of them are semi-cloistered, but those are the ones that are really, they're growing in numbers because there's a sense of excitement about doing something really different and unusual.
Yeah.
And
it's almost like I was thinking, like, people have wonderfully, because I mean, it's one of the things that Vatican II suggested, which a lot of people ignored, was the laity praying the divine office again.
Yes.
And the liturgy of the hours. And I was almost thinking, like, people often pray like lauds, or is it lauds? Cheers. One of the morning ones anyway. Pray morning prayer or evening prayer, whatever. I wonder for some people would it actually be most appealing to pray matins, just like get up in the middle of the night and pray the 3 o'clock one. Yeah. Just because it is so different, and it's so like it's like a big investment, but it's kind of cool. It's like it's kind of Jedi, like.
Or even I would say that there's a tendency, particularly in our sort of very electronic age, to stay up later and to be kind of consumed. So it's almost like you could use matins as a trigger to get out of that.
Yes,
like, don't stay up this late.
Yes, a good point.
Yeah, I think that's really, really cool. I think we're going to bring up just a couple more examples of weirdness in Catholic culture and art. Speaking of doing the morning prayer and evening prayer, I was reading about this in last month's edition of the Magnificat, which reminded me, I had known it just hadn't been called to mind for a while, which was that Salvador Dali had this incredible conversion at not the end of his life. There was he still produced art for a great many years afterwards, but in the latter half of his life, that he reverted back to Catholicism, and he actually renounced surrealism.
Okay.
And so he wrote this manifesto, which it's really funny because it's very Salvador Dali. That it's very self-assured and almost I'd say definitely self-aggrandizing, but it's actually really surprising. And the weird thing is that he was converted through science and math, and that he said he was a Catholic without any belief because he felt like he didn't believe, but that all of science was telling him that God existed and that he existed in the Catholic Church. So I just thought that was really interesting for someone who's so artistic to have been converted by science.
Yes, yeah.
And I think we can tend to put people in boxes that like, if you're interested in art, you'll be converted by art.
Yes, yeah.
But I just thought it's really interesting. So this was in his manifesto renouncing surrealism. A brilliant inspiration shows me that I have an unusual weapon at my disposal to help me penetrate to the core of reality, mysticism. That is to say, the profound intuitive knowledge of what is direct communication with the all-absolute vision by the grace of truth, by the grace of God. In this state of intense prophecy, it became clear to me that means of pictorial expression achieved their greatest perfection and effectiveness in the Renaissance, and that the decadence of modern painting was a consequence of skepticism and lack of faith, the result of mechanistic materialism. By reviving Spanish mysticism, I, Dali, shall use my work to demonstrate the unity of the universe by showing the spirituality of all substance. And the really interesting thing about that, as I said, he is renouncing surrealism.
Yes. Yeah.
But he didn't completely change his artistic style. His artistic style remains very identifiably Dali.
Sure.
Now, he does a lot of human forms at this time, which I could be wrong, but the art history that I did focused on a lot of his surreal paintings, which they have that like half of a person's face in the sand, but they're not necessarily the human form. And everyone knows that's from the one with the melting clocks, and that that's the epitome of surrealism. But it's not that he disregards all of that and disregards his own talents and his own kind of areas of expertise, but he integrates it. So like I said, there's one of the Last Supper, there's an incredible one of Our Lady holding the baby Jesus, which is broken up into blocks that are sort of floating above the desert. But the two that are the most famous and the most iconic to me, and actually my brother has one of them hanging in his room, which is there's one of the crucifix, and I think it's specifically the crucifix, he's doing it through the lens of St. John.
Okay, wow.
And then he does one of the Ascensions. So the crucifix has this wild angle where you're looking straight down on Jesus on the cross. and that you can kind of see the curve of the earth below him, and it has fishing boats and things like that underneath him. And the ascension is almost the exact reverse. You actually get the soles of his feet.
Oh, wow, okay.
Going, so you're directly under him and he's going up into heaven. And he also has this really interesting one of Our Lady of Guadalupe, where he shows her as like quite an old woman, and he uses all of these kind of layered patterns on her clothes. So they do evoke the surrealism of Dali's earlier work, but they're directed towards this encounter with God and this idea of the sublime and the otherworldly.
Yes,
so it's like, it's almost like he takes those elements of surrealism, which are talking about how the ineffable nature of understanding the world around you, and then puts them to use in terms of Catholic theology. And it's really fascinating.
That's great. It's almost like he's baptizing surrealism for like purposes of Catholic culture. Which I love. That's great. No, I'm not sure I've seen like any of those, so I really must give them a
I know. The other one, pretty sure Picasso kind of stayed in the mindset that he kind of established with Cubism. But one of the really interesting ones about Picasso is there's this very early painting of his. I think he was still in his teens when he painted it, but it's of girls getting their first Holy Communion, and it is the least Picasso picture you might ever think of.
Okay, wow.
Because he started, that's the thing that I think people don't necessarily understand about Picasso. When they see these kind of angular figures, they might think that he painted that way because that's how he could paint. But the reality was, Picasso was so good that his father was a painter, and when Picasso was still a child, he painted some pigeons, and his father literally never painted again because he could not be as good as his son.
Wow.
So he came from a very classical point of view. So, but that's kind of beside the point. But I just love that again, like Picasso has these examples of these very like straightforward religious paintings. And that you can draw on those elements no matter what you're doing.
Yeah. And I think that's actually, you actually see this in so many things. They have at least some measure of Christian imagery. I remember I found it very funny. There's I haven't watched it yet, I'm not sure I ever will, but there's a famous Japanese anime called Neon Genesis Evangelion. But there's a lot of Christian imagery in it of like angels and crosses and stuff like that. And somebody once asked the creator, like, why did you do it? Like, what was the meaning behind that? And he was like, oh, I just thought it looked cool. It's like no one can escape it, even if they like don't necessarily have an intellectual or spiritual meaning towards putting into it. They just like, they're fascinated by it. It's like, I remember you used the quote from Mean Girls. It's like, why are you so obsessed with us?
That's really true. And like you see it all the time when I see people wearing cross patterns on leggings and things like that. And like on some level, I'm kind of like, that's a bit like it's a bit corporate and a bit materialistic for me. But at the same time, it's like, why do you care? Like, why are you wearing this?
Yes, yeah.
So, I think that's really interesting that it's so imbibed in the culture that almost people can't get away from it. I think the final example that I have is, and I'm not entirely sure, I don't know that much about his biography, so I know he was definitely in communion towards the end of his life, but I don't know what his life was like during his kind of heyday. But Alfred Hitchcock was also raised as a Catholic, went to Catholic school, and made two very explicitly Catholic movies. One was called The Wrong Man, and the other one is called I Confess. I will confess that I have not seen either of them.
Neither have I.
But yeah, and they're both about, in one case, the I Confess one is about a priest who gets framed for a murder, and he can't almost defend himself because the actual murder has come to him for confession.
Wow.
And the other one is also about a Catholic man who gets wrongly accused, and the imagery of his rosary beads is very prominent in it.
Okay.
But all of his work was very Catholic inspired, I would say. The one that jumps out to me is in Vertigo. Like, first of all, there is that huge symbolism around the colours, and that you can have a kind of ritualization of dressing up in a particular way, but also just that play of good and evil that goes on in his, and certainly weird. Like he's sort of really famous for these strange and off-kilter stories, but that doesn't mean that they can't have a Catholic genesis.
Yes, yeah. No, I mean, there's like, even a lot of the climactic scenes in Vertigo take place on a bell tower in a church. Yeah,
exactly.
And
that's
it's like,
what I was saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you walk in. And I noticed it because I watched that, and I also rewatched another classic, Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life, this Christmas.
Another Catholic filmmaker, Frank Capra.
Is it? Okay, yes. Wow, fantastic. Yeah, no, I mean, Vertigo, obviously enjoyed It's a Wonderful Life a lot more. Vertigo is a very tough film, but obviously incredibly well made. But in both of them, there's like a 5-second shot of like a really beautiful high altar in the background almost, or like it's just like there. It mightn't even necessarily be Catholic. I don't know whether it is or not, because probably Lutheran and Episcopalian churches at the time didn't look a million miles different.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how that's imagery of the very beautiful, high east-facing altar is like. It was something that was part of it.
Yeah, and I think I talked about this with Chloe when we were talking about monsters, and that Catholicism is sort of uniquely positioned for those kinds of stories because there is an externalization of your internal struggles. And so it's so fitting that Hitchcock, who is that master of the psychological examination of wrestling between good and evil, or control and chaos, or any of those things, that he has that ability to render that visual and make it sort of tangible for people.
Yes.
Which I think is just beautiful. And the last thing, going back to just artwork, that I was going to say is that I gave a shout out in the last episode for the things that I like to the newest edition of Dappled Things. And I said at the time, and just to recap, that one of the things that they do for Dappled Things is they pick a particular artist for each edition. And so that's the artist has the cover of the journal, and then there's also like pages devoted within the journal to their artwork. And the artist for the most recent one is Giovanni Gasparo, who does beautiful human figure paintings, but a lot of them are really strange as well.
Okay.
And so a kind of recurring theme is that he has a person doing an action, and it's almost like a layered flip book where you can see all of the actions at once. So each person has maybe like 4 sets of hands that are, so like there's a woman praying the rosary, and so she has all of her different positions of her hands praying the rosary.
Oh, wow.
Or falling down, St. Peter falling down after his denial of Christ, I believe it is, and it shows his like hands as he's falling down. Oh, wow. And weirdly, the thing that it reminded me most of, and I think we can take for granted how classical or even medieval, I think sometimes people expect medieval things to be a bit strange, but I was specifically thinking of Fra Angelico, who is one of the greatest Catholic artists and the greatest artists of all time. But one of my favourite paintings of his, it has Christ in the middle, and it has these disembodied hands, and so one has like a whip, and the other has like, one is slapping him, and it shows like 2 different angles of the hand slapping him.
Okay, right.
But they're literally just hands like floating in the air around him, which is such an unusual representation of that. Like, it feels very modern actually, and it feels very weird, and it really reminded me in those paintings of in the Dapple things. So I love that something that can feel very modern is actually got these roots in this ancient Catholic tradition.
No, I love that, yeah, because my sister was actually, I haven't seen them yet, but my sister was telling me about them, and she was saying, because she studies animation, so she's very sort of big on art, but she was talking about how it's almost like good modern art, if you want to be so bold. It's using like experimental means, while also, taking in that sort of it's like the hermeneutic of continuity Pope Benedict talked about, but in the realm of art, I suppose, in the realm of sort of prayer and liturgy. It's that idea that you are taking something old and you're taking a new take on it, but it's still very clear where you came from, but you're also introducing something very foreign and interesting. Yeah,
and that ability to confront people and shock people in a way that it isn't just for kicks, it isn't just for setting yourself apart for the sake of not being like other people, that it can serve a really evangelical purpose and draw people towards Christ, which I think is really interesting.
Yes, amen.
Do you have any other points you want to touch on before we finish?
I think I'm fine. Excellent. I think things can wait to a further day.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure we'll have you back on soon. So that means that we only have one thing left, which is to talk about something you like at the moment.
Something I like at the moment. What do I like at the moment? Well, I'm actually, can I do like 2?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I go for 2? So I'm actually going to sneak in a sneaky recommendation, which it's something I read very recently, within the last few weeks, and it's like an 11-page essay, and I took several quotes from it today, and something we didn't really touch on, but it's very much on the subject of today, and it's an essay called Convertere Israel Dominum Deum Tuum, so convert, O Israel, to the Lord your God, I think, by a Benedictine monk called Brother, I'm not going to pronounce the name correctly, Evagrius, Evagrius, I don't know, and it's whether the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass ought to be celebrated towards the East. So if you ever have any interest in that area, or just interest in Catholic culture or liturgy or anything like that, it was a dream read. It's like in the Thomistic style, so it's like he does a bunch of objections then answers them, but just the quotes from, like, I use several quotes from that he quoted in it, so it's a treat to read, but I would recommend that. And then secondly, quite different, one of mine and Rachel's shared interests, other than Bleachers. They're
Yes.
a fantastic band.
I would really, honestly, I'm going to see if I can do like a Catholic slant on Bleachers.
That would be really interesting. But so specifically they did a concert with, or I guess they did a concert with MTV Unplugged, the MTV Unplugged session. And I would highly recommend listening to that with the best earphones that you can get, because I've listened to it twice with different earphones, and the one with the better earphones, it was a much more enjoyable experience.
That's so cool.
But yeah, I would highly recommend that as well.
Yeah. Oh, I don't think I've actually listened to that Bleachers.
I've
listened to most Bleachers.
Yes, no, exactly. Actually, it was partially, so it was my aforementioned sister and Rachel who actually got me into it, so cred to them.
And just to give a bit of background, Bleachers is a band, but it's primarily fronted by Jack Antonoff, but it's got a very 80s sound,
yes.
and I'm a big fan. They've got 2 albums, Gone Now and Strange Desires.
Yes.
Strange Desires, there you go. maybe that's my in.
There we go, yeah.
My Catholic.
You've probably heard a song co-written by him, though. He has co-written many things.
Yes.
Green Light by The Word. What else? Switched Up with Taylor Swift.
Yeah, Out of the Woods by Taylor Swift. He does a lot of producing. For the thing that I want to talk about, actually, this is kind of very much on topic, although it's not. I haven't found anything to suggest that it was written with any kind of Catholic slant, although I did find some kind of sacramental elements in it. It's a movie called You Were Never Really Here. And I will give an enormous warning about this film. It is a very violent film.
Okay.
Based on a book of the same name by a man called Jonathan Ames. And it's about a man his job is to be hired to rescue girls from sexual exploitation. And so it opens with one job, but it essentially follows with just the one job for the entire movie. And it's a beautifully shot. The music is incredible. It stars Joaquin Phoenix and is directed by Lynn Ramsey. She directed We Need to Talk About Kevin, if anyone has watched that. But some of it is tonally a little like Taxi Driver, but it's definitely got a really beautiful style to it. And the thing that I would say in defense of it being quite a violent film, and it is, so please don't go into it thinking it's not, but it's not at all what you would expect it to be in some ways. I think there's so many elements of it that I think steer away from self-indulgence. So there's lots of violence in it, but you don't actually see a lot of the violence up close. You actually see the aftermath of the violence.
Okay, sure.
Quite up close, which I think is often the direct opposite in a lot of movies. Like you see the fight going down, but you don't see the person afterwards.
Yeah,
you know?
it's a good way.
And so you see the implications of violence and the result of violence and the aftermath of violence, but it actually tends to give you quite a far distant shot of when the violence is actually happening. And the same, I would also say, very impressively, the same about the exploitation element of it. It's not in that respect, I would not call it a scandalous movie. I think they do an amazing job of representing and displaying the danger and the harm that these girls are in without further exploiting the girls who have to enact it for the movie.
Yeah, sure.
So I think that's done really, really tastefully and really well, that it's suggested and you understand what's going on, but without having to be really explicit about it, which I really like. And the other element I think is really in its favour is that it's really short. It's like 89 minutes, which I think I'm a big fan of short movies, actually. I think there's been sort of like time creep on a lot of movies. That some movies that deserve it, I think Shawshank Redemption is perfect. I would never touch it. But I think there's been sort of creep on a lot of movies that don't deserve to be as long as they are. And so particularly for a movie that in some ways is hard to watch and is quite intense, I think it shows a level of self-restraint to make it short and to not just draw out that for as long as possible for kicks or for scandal or for any of those things. So it got a lot of nominations and a lot of awards earlier in the year, but it's been completely overlooked for the Oscars. Sure. I would like to give it a little shout. You Were Never Really Here. So, and I think that's it.
Yeah, that's it for us.
Incredible. So thank you very, very much for listening. The usual, please share, comment, rate, all of those good things. And until the next time, goodbye.
Bye.
This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.